Picture this. It's 1995, and Jean-Claude Van Damme is at the absolute peak of his career. His muscles are carved from marble, his splits are physics-defying, and his ego? Well, his ego is bigger than his biceps. But what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? What happens when raw arrogance collides with quiet strength? Today we're diving into the story of how Jean-Claude Van Damme made the biggest mistake of his life, challenging Chuck Norris to a fight. This isn't just a story about two martial artists. It's a story about respect, humility, and learning that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who never feel the need to show off. When Van Damme walked into that dojo in Texas, he thought he was about to teach an old man a lesson. Instead, he was about to receive the most humbling education of his entire life. Jean-Claude Van Damme was living in a world where he could do no wrong. Universal soldier, kickboxer, blood sport. Every movie was a box office hit. He'd spent years perfecting his craft, training his body into a weapon of mass destruction. His signature splits could make grown men weep, and his roundhouse kicks could shatter concrete blocks. But success had poisoned his mind. Van Damme believed his own hype. In interviews, he'd boast about being the greatest martial artist alive. At parties, he'd challenge anyone to prove they could match his strength. His inner circle fed his ego with constant praise. Deep down, beneath all that muscle and bravado, there was an insecurity eating at him. He needed to know he was truly the best, not just on screen, but in real life. Meanwhile, in Texas, Chuck Norris was living a completely different reality. The man who had dominated action cinema in the 80s had quietly stepped back from the spotlight. He ran a small martial arts academy, teaching kids discipline and respect. Chuck had nothing left to prove to anyone. But Van Damme didn't see wisdom in Chuck's retirement. He saw weakness. He saw an old man who had stepped aside because he couldn't compete with the new generation. That perception would become Van Damme's biggest mistake. The confrontation began with a phone call. Van Damme, fueled by whiskey and surrounded by his entourage at a Hollywood party, decided it was time to cement his legacy. "Chuck, my friend," Van Damme slurred into the phone, his Belgian accent thick with alcohol. "The fans always ask who would win between us. Maybe it's time we give them an answer, no?" Chuck's voice was calm, measured. "Jean-Claude, I'm not interested in proving anything to anyone anymore." "Ah, but this is exactly the problem," Van Damme interrupted. "You hide behind this peaceful teacher act, but we both know the truth. You are afraid you cannot keep up with the new generation. With me." The silence stretched for an eternity. Chuck's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Jean-Claude," Chuck finally responded, his voice controlled but carrying an edge. "If you feel you need to prove something, you're welcome to come to my dojo in Texas. But if you come here looking for a fight, you better be prepared for what that actually means." Van Damme laughed, devoid of any real joy. "Oh, I will be there, mon ami. And when I am finished, everyone will know who the real champion is." Chuck slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. His students watched as their normally serene teacher closed his eyes and took a deep breath. They knew that Jean-Claude Van Damme had just made a terrible mistake. 3 days later, Van Damme's black limousine pulled up outside Chuck's modest dojo. He stepped out wearing designer workout gear that cost more than most people's monthly salary, his muscles gleaming with professional oil. He strutted into the dojo like he owned it, his entourage trailing behind. Children's class had just ended, and small kids looked up at this strange, oiled giant who had invaded their peaceful space. Chuck emerged wearing a simple white jai, no flashy embellishments. The contrast was striking. Van Damme looked like a magazine cover, while Chuck looked like what he was, a teacher comfortable in his own skin. "So," Van Damme announced loudly, "the great Chuck Norris finally emerges from hiding. Tell me, old man, when was the last time you actually fought someone who could fight back?" "Jean-Claude, there are children here. If you want to do this—" "Children should see what real martial arts looks like," Van Damme interrupted, beginning an elaborate stretching display. That's when Chuck's demeanor shifted. His shoulders squared, his breathing deepened, and something ancient and dangerous flickered behind his eyes. The students recognized the change immediately. This wasn't their gentle teacher anymore. This was the man who had survived Vietnam, who had fought when fighting meant everything. Van Damme, blinded by arrogance, completely missed the warning signs. As Chuck watched Van Damme pose for cameras, his mind drifted back 30 years. He remembered Vietnam, where martial arts wasn't about movie contracts, it was about survival. He remembered underground tournaments where fights ended when someone couldn't continue. He thought about his Korean master who taught him that true strength comes from within. A river that runs deep makes little noise, the old man had said, but it can carve through mountains. Chuck had spent decades learning to control his power, deliberately stepping away from the spotlight because he understood that true mastery isn't about defeating others, it's about conquering yourself. But sometimes a lesson needs to be taught the hard way. Chuck looked at his students, some as young as 6, watching with confusion. They looked to him for guidance, for an example of how to handle bullies. Walking away would send the wrong message. "Clear the mats," he said quietly. "Make sure the children are in the back room." As the dojo emptied, Chuck began his preparation. Not flashy acrobatics, but something infinitely more ominous. He centered himself and tapped into something he hadn't accessed in years. The cold, focused mindset of a warrior. Van Damme was still performing for cameras, oblivious to what he had awakened. The fight lasted exactly 17 seconds. Van Damme opened with his signature spinning heel kick. Picture perfect, camera ready, and absolutely useless against someone who had spent 40 years learning to read attacks before they happened. Chuck simply wasn't there when the kick arrived. He'd moved with the economy of motion that comes from real experience, slipping inside Van Damme's guard like water flowing around stone. Before Van Damme could register what happened, Chuck's hand was pressed gently against his throat, and his feet were no longer touching the ground. It wasn't violent or dramatic. It was simply inevitable, like watching gravity work. "The fight is over," Chuck said quietly, his voice carrying no anger, no triumph, just simple fact. Van Damme suddenly understood the vast difference between movie fighting and real martial arts. In films, everything was choreographed, predictable, safe. This was something else entirely. Chuck gently lowered Van Damme to the ground. "Martial arts isn't about proving you're better than someone else, Jean-Claude. It's about proving you're better than who you used to be." The footage never saw the light of day, but not to protect Van Damme's image. After the brief encounter, Chuck did something unexpected. Instead of gloating, he invited Van Damme for tea. They sat in the small office, and Chuck shared something more valuable than any fighting technique. "I used to be angry all the time," Chuck confided. "Angry at the world, at other fighters. That anger made me strong, but it also made me weak. Real strength isn't about what you can destroy. It's about what you can protect and nurture." Van Damme found himself listening in a way he hadn't in years. "I came here to humiliate you," he admitted. "I know," Chuck replied simply. "Sometimes that's the first step toward wisdom, realizing how little you actually know." When Van Damme left that evening, he was a different man than the one who had arrived. Years later, Van Damme would tell people that his encounter with Chucknorris changed his life. Not because he was beaten, but because he learned something about true strength that no training could teach. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. Real mastery doesn't require validation. The most dangerous people are often the gentlest because they have nothing left to prove and everything to protect. Chuck went back to teaching his students, passing on not just fighting techniques but life lessons about respect and humility. Van Damme began incorporating those lessons into his own life, becoming not just a better fighter, but a better man. The greatest victories aren't won in front of cameras. They're won in quiet moments, in small acts of wisdom, in choosing to lift someone up instead of tear them down. Because true strength isn't about how hard you can hit, it's about how gently you can guide someone toward becoming the person they were meant to be.